This week we look at number 8 in our series going through the book of Joshua. This one is Giants of Faith, Caleb and Joshua. You remember, they were the 2 spies that were sent out along with the other 10 to see what the land of Canaan was really like. And their report was, yes, we can go in and take it over. Yes, there's some significant enemies there. Yes, there's all these other issues, but we can do it with God's strength. We can do it. The 10 come back and they say, no way. This is just too difficult. There are giants in the land and so on. And interesting, in their report, they never mention God once. They aren't convinced about God's support. They don't care about that. They see things purely from what I want to say is a secular point of view, a very humanistic. This is the issue. There's us and there's them, and God is discounted. Whereas for Caleb and Joshua, they had faith and they believed in God, and they were convinced that since God promised what he had done, he could fulfill his promises. So there in Joshua 14 and Joshua 19, you see kind of the conclusion of all this. In Joshua 14, Caleb comes to Joshua and says, remember what happened. And as you think about those events at the beginning of their time in the wanderings through the the desert, what it must have been like for Caleb and Joshua even to retain their faith after that disappointment. 40 years later, they're going into the promised land. Do you think that they might have been tempted to say, what are you people talking about? Because of that foolish response. Remember that when they came back with the other 10, the people believed the 10 and they didn't believe Joshua and Caleb, and they wanted to stone them, and God had to intervene to prevent that. And Caleb and Joshua must have wondered for those 40 years, what would have happened if we had all been convinced? We would have been there. We'd have had 40 years in the promised land already. I think I would have been tempted to complain just a little bit about exactly what this was all about. And I think that as we think about our own personal lives, it's really a challenge to deal not only with our own personal experiences, but those around us, especially when they are kind of denying what we believe is really important and what is really true. So Caleb comes and says, you remember what happened? You remember the whole story? You remember what we decided and what we all agreed on? And now I'm asking for my allowance, as it were, of the allotment in the promised land. And he asks for Hebron and the surrounding areas, and that's what he's given. And he says, don't worry about taking care of this. I'm going to go ahead and do this, and so on. He's still confident, and he's still physically able, even after all those years. And then in Joshua 19, he also gets his allotted inheritance in terms of the land that he has there in Canaan. And he sees the rewards for his faithfulness. These are giants of faith. As I say, I would have loved to have known what Caleb and Joshua thought about for those 40 years, wandering through the wilderness with the people who were not cooperative, let's be blunt. And God had to say to that generation, I'm leaving you behind. You're staying here in the desert. Your bones will be left here, and only your children will go into the promised land. Only Caleb and Joshua of all that generation went in because they were faithful to God. And not only in the experience of going out and being the spies to spy out the promised land, but in all that time subsequently, which is demonstrated when you come to those 2 chapters we just referenced. They are still faithful to what God had said, faithful to what God had promised. And so I think there's some wonderful lessons. Yes, I'm sure they made many mistakes, like we all do, but they trusted God right there at the beginning, and at the end they're still trusting in God. Wouldn't that be something that you would want to have as a memorial for you? I trusted God and he saw me through. That kind of thing. Let's think about that as we study and as we consider what God does in our lives, and let us be giants of faith in the same way.